In courtrooms across America, the line between sanity and evil has been tested by blood, obsession, and betrayal. These are the cases where justice faced madness, and the verdict changed history. The story begins in New York City, a city already alive with noise, energy, and ambition. But beneath the neon lights and bustling crowds, fear slowly took root. Fear of a faceless man who believed he had been wronged, and who would make the city pay for what he saw as an unforgivable injustice. For over 16 years, one man planted crude bombs across New York. In phone booths, theaters, train stations, even the seats where unsuspecting families sat down to watch a movie. He signed his letters simply FP, short for Fair Play. But history would remember him by another name, the Mad Bomber. It was November 16, 1940, when the first device appeared. Outside the headquarters of Consolidated Edison, New York's electric power company, police discovered a small pipe bomb. It had been carefully built, but it did not explode. The device came with a note, scrawled in block letters. Con Edison crooks, this is for you. The message was as important as the weapon itself. The bomber wanted his grievance to be known. He wanted his anger to be heard. At first, investigators weren't sure what to make of it. A malfunctioning homemade bomb, a bizarre note, and no suspects. Then, 10 months later, another bomb appeared near Con Edison's offices. Again, it didn't detonate. This one was different. Its triggering mechanism was an alarm clock, but it hadn't been wound. The precision suggested intelligence. The failure suggested either luck or hesitation. Police began to suspect a pattern. Someone with a grudge against the power company, someone persistent, and perhaps someone who wanted attention more than blood. But soon, the bombs began to explode. In the 1940s and early 50s, New York was no stranger to crime. Mobsters controlled entire neighborhoods. Robberies and homicides made daily headlines, and wartime anxieties weighed on every family. Yet this was different. This was not about money, nor passion, nor organized crime. It was about vengeance. In March 1950, a device was discovered inside Grand Central Station. Bigger, more sophisticated, more dangerous. 2 failed to detonate. But just weeks later, on April 24th, a bomb exploded inside a telephone booth at the New York Public Library. The blast shattered glass and sent metal fragments across the lobby. Miraculously, no one was injured. The city had a serial bomber. Through the early 1950s, explosions rocked public spaces. Theaters, subways, phone booths. Letters signed FP arrived at newspapers, threatening further attacks. The writer promised he would not bomb during wartime, citing patriotic feelings. But now that the war was over, he declared his mission renewed. By 1951, the press had a name for him, the Mad Bomber. The name stuck, partly because it captured the public's imagination, and partly because law enforcement seemed powerless to stop him. He was meticulous. He was patient. He blended in. The psychological profile of the Mad Bomber would become a landmark moment in American law enforcement. Police, desperate for answers, turned to a psychiatrist named Dr. James A. Brussel. A veteran of World War II and Korea, Brussel had experience with military psychiatry, but never before had he been asked to look into the mind of an unknown criminal. Brussel studied the bomber's letters, noting the strange phrasing and formal language. He studied the crime scenes, the construction of the devices, the persistence of the attacks. And then he made bold predictions. The bomber would be a man, likely middle-aged, between 40 and 50. He would be unmarried, a loner, probably living with female relatives. He would have an Eastern European background, possibly Catholic. He would live in Connecticut, not New York, but close enough to travel easily. And when caught, he would be wearing a double-breasted suit, buttoned. It sounded absurdly specific. Some detectives scoffed, but they had little else to go on. So they released the profile to the public. And the Mad Bomber couldn't resist. Letters poured in, furious letters written in the same style, using the same odd phrases. In one, the writer revealed a key piece of information. He had once worked for Consolidated Edison And in 1931, he had been injured on the job. He felt cheated, abandoned, left to suffer without compensation. Detectives dug into the company's files. Buried in the archives, they found the name George Metesky, a disgruntled former employee, a man injured in a boiler accident in 1931, who claimed the blast had left him with lasting pain and tuberculosis. His compensation claims had been denied. His anger had festered for decades. When police arrived at his home in Waterbury, Connecticut, in January 1957, they found exactly what Brussel had predicted. A stocky, unmarried man, living with his sisters of Lithuanian descent. In the basement, they discovered his bomb-making workshop. And when Metesky was asked to change clothes before being taken away, he emerged in a buttoned, double-breasted suit. The profile had been eerily accurate. In custody, Metesky admitted everything. He claimed responsibility for more than 30 bombs across New York. 22 had exploded. Dozens of people had been injured, though none fatally. For 16 years, he had terrorized a city, not out of greed or ideology, but out of rage at a corporation he believed had ruined his life. Psychiatrists examined him and declared him mentally ill, suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. He was deemed incompetent to stand trial and sent to Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. He would spend the next 16 years there, never tried, never convicted. Released in 1973 after the maximum period of confinement expired, he returned to Connecticut, living quietly until his death in 1994 at the age of 90. The case of the Mad Bomber was groundbreaking, not only because of the scale of fear he spread, but because it marked the first widely recognized use of criminal profiling in the United States. Yet the profile was not a magic bullet. Much of it relied on generalizations, luck, and psychological guesswork. Investigators still had to do the hard work of combing through records, connecting dots, and chasing leads. But the story captured the public imagination, the idea that a skilled psychologist could read the mind of a criminal, sketch his portrait, and point the way to his capture. In truth, it was a mix of luck, persistence, and one man's inability to let go of his anger. George Metesky's bombs made New York bleed and tremble, but they also paved the way for the development and the myth of modern criminal profiling. And so, in the shadows of Broadway and Times Square, amid the city's brightest lights, New York learned what it meant to be held hostage not by an army, not by a mob, but by a single man with a grudge, a skill with metal and powder, and a twisted sense of what he called fair play. The murder of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, remains one of the most dissected moments in American history. The motorcade rolling through Dallas, the shots from the Texas School Book Depository, the stunned silence that swept across the world. It is an event remembered in grainy film, in shattered innocence, and in endless speculation. And at the center of it all stood a man whose name became synonymous with betrayal, Lee Harvey Oswald. But Oswald did not arrive at that sixth-floor window by accident. His life was a story of instability, alienation, and restless defiance. To understand why his name is forever linked to assassination, we must go back, to a childhood marked by loss, to an adolescence shaped by defiance, and to a young adulthood spent chasing ideologies that never gave him the belonging he craved. Lee Harvey Oswald was born on October 18, 1939, in New Orleans. He never met his father. 2 months before Lee's birth, his father died of a heart attack, leaving his mother, Marguerite, to raise 3 sons on her own. Marguerite was strong-willed, often stubborn, and, according to many who knew her, self-absorbed. She worked tirelessly to support the family but carried with her an air of bitterness. She often reminded her children how difficult life had become without their father. For Lee, the youngest, it created a world of instability. As a toddler, he spent time in an orphanage because his mother couldn't manage 3 boys on her own. When he returned to her care, he was withdrawn, already shaped by feelings of abandonment. Neighbors recalled a boy who preferred isolation, who rarely joined in neighborhood games, and who seemed to live in a world of his own. School did not bring him much stability. By the age of 10, Lee had already been enrolled in 6 different schools. He was bright. Intelligent tests later placed him above average, but restless, often skipping classes and ignoring authority. His teachers described him as temperamental, quick to anger, and unwilling to follow rules. At home, things were little better. His mother moved frequently, pulling him in and out of communities before he could establish lasting friendships. He grew attached to a stepfather at one point, but when that marriage collapsed, Lee lost yet another figure he had come to rely on. The pattern repeated: attachment, disruption, resentment. By his early teens, Lee's defiance reached a new level. In New York, where he briefly lived with his half-brother, tensions escalated to violence. One day, an argument over television spiraled until Lee pulled a knife on his sister-in-law. The boy was 13. The incident alarmed his family, but his mother minimized it, insisting that Lee was simply misunderstood. The authorities, however, took note. By the spring of 1953, Lee was skipping school with alarming frequency. A truancy case brought him before a juvenile court, and soon he was placed in Youth House, a detention and evaluation center in New York City. There, for the first time, Oswald was subjected to a comprehensive psychiatric assessment. Dr. Renatus Hartogs, a psychiatrist, described Lee as tense, withdrawn, and emotionally disturbed. He showed little interest in others, claimed he disliked people altogether, and admitted to hitting his mother when angry. Hartogs diagnosed him with a personality pattern disturbance, what we might today call a personality disorder, with schizoid and passive-aggressive features. He concluded that Lee was at risk for explosive outbursts and recommended ongoing psychiatric care. Psychological testing confirmed the picture. A boy of above-average intelligence, capable of much more than he was showing in school, but socially isolated and emotionally damaged. And yet, nothing lasting was done. The court ordered probation and outpatient treatment, but his mother resisted, skipping appointments and eventually leaving New York altogether to avoid the system. Lee never received the therapy that might have helped him confront his anger and alienation. It was a missed opportunity, one of many in Oswald's troubled life. By 17, Oswald sought escape in a new identity: the United States Marine Corps. Lying about his age, he tried to enlist early but was initially rejected. By 1956, however, he was officially a Marine. The military gave him structure, but it also magnified his contradictions. He excelled at marksmanship, a skill that would later haunt history, but clashed constantly with authority. He spent time in the brig for insubordination and misconduct. Fellow Marines found him strange, aloof, and obsessed with politics. It was during this time that Oswald embraced Marxism. He read avidly about communism, spoke admiringly of the Soviet Union, and declared his loyalty to an ideology that most Americans feared and despised. His comrades nicknamed him Oswaldovich. In 1959, at age 19, he made a radical decision. He would defect to the Soviet Union. Oswald's journey to the USSR was dramatic. Arriving in Moscow on a tourist visa, he announced that he wanted to renounce his American citizenship and become a Soviet citizen. When told his request would be denied, he staged a desperate act, slashing his wrist in an apparent suicide attempt. Soviet officials, alarmed, allowed him to stay. For 2 years, he lived in Minsk, working in a radio factory, married a Russian woman named Marina, and experienced life in the communist system he had idolized. But reality disappointed him. The Soviet Union was not the utopia he had imagined. Bureaucracy, shortages, and restrictions frustrated him. His marriage grew strained. Disillusionment set in. By 1962, Oswald returned to the United States with Marina and their infant daughter. But the return brought no stability. Back in America, he bounced between jobs, struggled financially, and clung to radical politics. He distributed pro-Cuba pamphlets, argued with anyone who would listen, and drifted toward extremism. Friends and acquaintances described him as angry, arrogant, and impossible to satisfy. He lived in a cycle of grievance, against his family, his employers, his country, always searching for recognition, always convinced he was destined for something greater. And so, by November 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald was a man at war with the world. On the morning of November 22nd, he carried a rifle wrapped in paper into the Texas School Book Depository, where he worked. By midday, 3 shots rang out across Dealey Plaza. President Kennedy slumped forward in his limousine, mortally wounded. Governor John Connally was struck as well. Within hours, Oswald was arrested. Within 2 days, he was dead, shot by nightclub owner Jack Ruby on live television, silencing him forever and leaving the world to speculate on his motives. Psychologists and historians have debated Oswald ever since. Was he a true believer in communism? A loner driven by resentment? A mentally ill man spiraling into violence? Or simply a disaffected young man desperate for significance, who found it in the most destructive way imaginable? The psychiatric portrait from his youth offers clues: isolation, anger, instability, and an unaddressed need for belonging. But it offers no simple answer. What is clear is this: Lee Harvey Oswald was not an ordinary man. He was the product of neglect, instability, and defiance. A life of restless searching that ended in one of the most shocking acts in American history. And with his death at the hands of Jack Ruby, the chance to ever truly understand him was lost. The assassin's voice was silenced, leaving only speculation, controversy, and the echo of gunfire in Dealey Plaza. In February of 1974, America watched in disbelief as a story unfolded that seemed torn from the pages of a crime thriller. A young woman from one of the wealthiest families in the country vanished from her Berkeley, California apartment, only to reappear weeks later, armed with an assault rifle, helping her kidnappers rob a bank. Her name was Patricia Hearst. To the world, she was Patty, the 19-year-old granddaughter of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, heir to a fortune, a symbol of privilege. But her story would become something far stranger. A tale of captivity, indoctrination, transformation, and ultimately, a courtroom battle over whether she was a victim of brainwashing or a willing revolutionary. The saga began on the night of February 4th, 1974. Patty was at home in Berkeley with her fiancé when armed intruders burst into the apartment. They beat her fiancé, blindfolded Patty, and dragged her into the trunk of a car. Hours later, her captors revealed themselves: the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, a small, radical leftist group obsessed with overthrowing what they called the fascist state. The SLA was no ordinary gang. They were self-styled revolutionaries, made up of disaffected students, activists, and ex-convicts. They saw themselves as soldiers in a war against racism, capitalism, and the American government. Their numbers were tiny, but their ambitions were grand. And now, with Patricia Hearst in their hands, they had a hostage who could give them a voice. From a makeshift hideout, the SLA released tapes to the media. Patty's voice, trembling but clear, could be heard reading their statements. At first, she pleaded for her family to meet the SLA's demands. Then, weeks later, her tone changed. On April 3rd, a tape arrived that shocked the nation. Patty Hearst, speaking in a firm, almost militant voice, announced that she had taken a new name, Tanya. She declared her allegiance to the SLA. And days later, surveillance cameras captured her holding a rifle during a bank robbery in San Francisco. The heiress was now a fugitive. America was transfixed. Was this the story of a wealthy young woman radicalized by her captors? Or was she a terrified victim acting under duress, saying whatever she had to in order to survive? To her family, it was clear. Patty had been brainwashed, coerced, psychologically broken. But to prosecutors and to much of the public, the images told a different story. She wasn't tied up. She wasn't gagged. She was carrying a weapon, standing side by side with her kidnappers. The line between victim and accomplice blurred with every new tape, every new appearance. For the SLA, Patricia Hearst was both pawn and prize. She gave them legitimacy, notoriety, and an audience. Their rhetoric raged against injustice, but their actions were reckless and violent. Shootouts with police followed, and in May 1974, a Los Angeles safe house was surrounded by authorities. A massive gun battle and fire consumed the building, killing 6 members of the SLA. Patty was not among them. For more than a year, she remained at large, traveling with surviving SLA members, appearing in robberies and communiques, her image plastered across newspapers as America's most unlikely outlaw. Finally, in September 1975, the law caught up with her. FBI agents stormed an apartment in San Francisco and arrested Patricia Hearst. Her trial the following year became a media spectacle. The defense argued she was a classic case of Stockholm Syndrome, a young woman so traumatized by captivity, so isolated, so brutalized, that she came to identify with her captors. Psychiatric experts testified that she had been brainwashed, stripped of free will, conditioned to obey through a mix of fear and manipulation. The prosecution countered with a starkly different picture. Patty Hearst, they said, was not brainwashed but converted. She had joined willingly, participated eagerly, and later used the brainwashing claim as an excuse. The evidence was damning: photographs of her holding weapons, her own recorded statements pledging allegiance to the SLA, eyewitnesses from the robberies. After months of testimony, the jury rejected the brainwashing defense. Patricia Hearst was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. But the story did not end there. Public opinion shifted. Some saw her as a dangerous radical, but many others, perhaps most, came to view her as a victim first, a criminal second. She served just 22 months before President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence. Decades later, President Bill Clinton issued her a full pardon. Today, Patricia Hearst lives a quiet life, far removed from the days when she was the poster child for political terror and psychological manipulation. Her case remains one of the most famous examples in American legal history of the question: how much control does the human mind truly have under extreme duress? Can a person be brainwashed to commit crimes they would never otherwise commit? Or is the claim of brainwashing too convenient, too easy an escape from accountability? Patricia Hearst's story never gave us a clear answer, but it forced a nation to confront the blurred line between victimhood and responsibility. And it reminded us that even in the most privileged lives, the human mind remains vulnerable to fear, coercion, and the desperate instinct to survive. On the night of October 5, 1974, the quiet town of Guildford, England, erupted in chaos. 2 bombs exploded in pubs frequented by British soldiers, the Horse and Groom and the Seven Stars. The blasts killed 5 people and injured dozens more. The Irish Republican Army, or IRA, was waging a violent campaign against the British state, and to the authorities, the Guildford bombings were part of that brutal war. Public fear was overwhelming. Politicians demanded swift justice. The pressure on police was immense. Within weeks, for young people, all with Irish backgrounds, were arrested. Their names would become infamous: Jerry Conlon, Paul Hill, Patrick Armstrong, and Carol Richardson. They were ordinary young men and women, far from hardened terrorists. But in the desperate hunt for answers, they were about to become scapegoats. The interrogations were relentless. For days and nights, police grilled the suspects. Sleep was scarce, intimidation constant. Officers lied, threatened, and manipulated, insisting they had overwhelming evidence, though in truth they had little. Jerry Conlon, just 20 years old, cracked under the pressure. He signed a confession, hoping the nightmare would end. Others followed. Soon, the police had written statements from all 4, confessions that placed them at the scene of the bombing. The problem? None of it was true. There was no forensic evidence linking them to the bombs, no eyewitnesses placing them at the pubs. But the confessions, crafted under duress, riddled with inconsistencies, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The trial was swift and the outcome devastating. In 1975, the Guildford Four were convicted of murder and given life sentences. The courtroom celebrated justice served. Newspapers carried headlines of triumph. The public breathed easier. But the truth was far darker. For innocent people had been condemned. Prison for the Guildford Four was brutal. They were branded as terrorists, isolated, abused, and consumed by despair. Jerry Conlon later recalled nights spent crying himself to sleep, wondering how his life had been destroyed by lies he had been pressured to sign. For years, their families campaigned tirelessly. Lawyers uncovered inconsistencies in the police investigation. Evidence surfaced that the confessions had been coerced. Even more damning, new information pointed to actual IRA members, known as the Balcombe Street Gang, who had carried out the attacks. But for more than a decade, the truth was ignored. Courts upheld the convictions. The system refused to admit error. Finally, in 1989, after 15 long years, the case collapsed. The Court of Appeal overturned the convictions, declaring the original police work a travesty of justice. The Guildford Four walked free. Their lives had been stolen, but at last, their innocence was recognized. The Guildford Four case became a chilling lesson in the psychology of false confessions. Under pressure, fear, and manipulation, people can and do admit to crimes they never committed. Psychologists studying the case highlighted key factors: coercive interrogation tactics, long hours, threats, and lies. Youth and vulnerability: the accused were young, isolated, and scared. Cognitive overload: when faced with relentless questioning, the human mind seeks escape, even if it means agreeing to falsehoods. Once a false confession is made, it becomes incredibly powerful in court. Jurors often believe, why would someone admit guilt if they weren't guilty? But the Guildford Four proved the terrible truth. False confessions can and do send innocent people to prison. The scandal shook Britain. It exposed systemic flaws in police interrogation methods and fueled reforms aimed at protecting suspects. The case also highlighted the dangers of public panic. When fear demands quick answers, justice can be the first casualty. For Jerry Conlon, freedom came too late to heal all wounds. His father, Giuseppe, had also been wrongly imprisoned in connection with the case and died in custody before his name was cleared. Jerry himself struggled for years with trauma, addiction, and the weight of injustice. When he died in 2014, many remembered him not only as a victim of wrongful conviction but also as a man who had fought to expose the dangers of coercion and the fragility of truth in the face of pressure. The Guildford Four remind us that justice is not only about catching the guilty. It is about protecting the innocent. And they remind us how terrifyingly easy it can be, under the weight of authority and fear, to hear the words, "You did it, so why not confess?" In 1969, on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, two young lives crossed paths. One was a shy, quiet student from India named Prasenjit Potter. The other was Tatiana Tarasov, a bright, outgoing young woman of Russian descent, raised in California, full of energy and warmth. Their brief connection would end in tragedy, and their story would ignite one of the most important debates in psychology and law. When must a therapist break confidentiality to prevent harm? Prasenjit Potter arrived in Berkeley as a graduate student in naval architecture. He was intelligent, disciplined, but socially awkward. Friends described him as reserved, intensely focused on his studies, and inexperienced with women. In 1968, at a folk dance class, he met Tatiana Tarasov. She was cheerful, attractive, and kind. For Potter, their meeting was electrifying. He became infatuated, convinced that Tatiana shared his feelings. Tatiana, however, did not see their relationship in the same way. To her, it was casual, friendship, perhaps flirtation, but nothing serious. She valued her independence and was not looking for commitment. But to Potter, her rejection was devastating. Over the months that followed, Potter withdrew. He grew depressed, anxious, and obsessed. He stopped attending classes, lost weight, and became increasingly fixated on Tatiana. By early 1969, his distress led him to seek help at the University Health Service. There, he was assigned to a psychologist named Dr. Lawrence Moore. In therapy, Potter confessed his turmoil. He admitted his obsession with Tatiana, and then, chillingly, he revealed his violent fantasies. He told Dr. Moore he intended to kill her. For any therapist, such a revelation is a moment of crisis. Confidentiality is the cornerstone of therapy. Patients must feel safe to speak their darkest thoughts. But when those thoughts involve threats of violence, the therapist faces an impossible choice: protect the patient's privacy or protect potential victims. Dr. Moore, deeply alarmed, consulted with his supervisor. Together, they decided action was necessary. Moore called the police and urged them to detain Potter for psychiatric evaluation. The police did take Potter into custody, but after questioning him, they released him, believing he was rational and not dangerous. Moore's concerns were dismissed. Potter stopped attending therapy, and no one warned Tatiana Tarasov. On October 27, 1969, Tatiana returned home from a trip abroad. Days later, Potter showed up at her house in Berkeley. Her parents were not home. Potter confronted her, and in a sudden eruption of violence, he stabbed Tatiana to death with a kitchen knife. The tragedy shocked the community. A young woman had died, even though warnings had been given, even though professionals had recognized the danger. Her parents, grief-stricken, demanded accountability. Why, they asked, had no one warned Tatiana? Why had confidentiality been valued more than their daughter's life? Their lawsuit against the University of California went all the way to the California Supreme Court. The central question was revolutionary. Does a therapist have a duty to warn potential victims when a patient threatens violence? In 1976, the court delivered its landmark ruling, Tarasov versus Regents of the University of California. The decision was clear. When a therapist determines that a patient poses a serious danger of violence to another, the therapist has a duty to take reasonable steps to protect the intended victim. Confidentiality, the court ruled, does not extend to situations of imminent threat. The words of the court were stark. The protective privilege ends where the public peril begins. The Tarasov ruling reshaped mental health practice across the United States. Therapists were now legally obligated to warn potential victims or law enforcement when credible threats emerged in treatment. But the case also sparked fierce debate. Critics argued that breaking confidentiality could destroy the trust essential to therapy. Patients might avoid seeking help or hide their true thoughts if they feared being reported. Supporters countered that public safety must come first, that Tatiana's death proved the cost of silence. The ripple effects spread worldwide. To this day, the duty to warn or duty to protect remains one of the most challenging ethical dilemmas in mental health. As for Prasenjit Potter, he was tried for second-degree murder, convicted, and sentenced to prison. He served 4 years before being released and deported back to India. Tatiana Tarasov's life was cut tragically short, but her name became immortal in the law. Every therapist in America learns the Tarasov duty, a reminder that sometimes protecting life outweighs protecting confidentiality. The case remains haunting. They argued that White was not a cold-blooded killer, but a man suffering from severe depression. His mental state, they said, was deteriorating. He had become increasingly erratic, withdrawn, and obsessed with feelings of failure. To illustrate his depression, the defense pointed to his change in behavior. Once health-conscious and active, White had abandoned his fitness routine. He binged on junk food, particularly sugary snacks and soft drinks. His attorneys argued that this change in diet reflected his depression, a visible symptom of his decline. One psychiatrist testified that White's consumption of sweets was a marker of his mental state. The press seized on one detail, Twinkies. The Twinkie defense, as it became known, was born, though not in the way most people remember. Contrary to the myth, White's lawyers never argued that eating Twinkies made him kill. They never claimed sugar caused murder. Instead, they suggested his junk food binging was evidence of depression, not the cause of his violence. But in the courtroom of public opinion, nuance was lost. Headlines mocked the idea that snack cakes could excuse homicide. Comedians ridiculed it, and Twinkie defense became shorthand for absurd legal excuses. The jury faced a difficult choice. They were instructed on multiple possible verdicts: first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or voluntary manslaughter. To convict of first-degree murder, they needed to believe White had planned the killings in cold blood. To convict of manslaughter, they needed to see him as a man overcome by sudden passion or diminished mental capacity. The defense humanized White. Friends and family testified to his stress, his decline, his inner turmoil. Psychiatric experts described his depression as profound. And the prosecution, overconfident, struggled to counter the narrative effectively. When the verdict was read, the city gasped. Dan White was found guilty not of murder, but of voluntary manslaughter. His sentence: 7 years, 8 months. The reaction was explosive. In San Francisco's Castro district, thousands gathered in outrage. The lenient verdict felt like an insult, especially to the gay community, who saw Harvey Milk's life and death dismissed as less valuable. That night, the anger boiled over into what became known as the White Night Riots. Protesters clashed with police, city hall windows shattered, police cars burned. It was one of the most violent civil disturbances in San Francisco's history. For many, the trial symbolized a deeper injustice, the system's tendency to excuse white, middle-class men while punishing others far more harshly. Dan White served just 5 years before being released on parole. Less than 2 years later, in 1985, he took his own life. His story ended in tragedy, but the reverberations of his case endured. The Twinkie defense became a cultural punchline, but also a cautionary tale about how psychiatric evidence can sway juries and how easily the public can misinterpret it. Legal scholars continue to point to the case as an example of how mental health testimony, when poorly explained, can distort both trials and public perception. Harvey Milk and George Moscone were memorialized as martyrs of progress. Milk, in particular, became a symbol of hope for the LGBTQ+ movement, his life celebrated even more because of its violent end. Dan White, meanwhile, became a symbol of failed justice, not because his depression wasn't real, but because the system's handling of it left the public with the impression that trivial excuses could erase accountability for deliberate acts of violence. The truth lies somewhere between myth and reality. Dan White was not driven to murder by snack cakes. He was a troubled man, consumed by bitterness, spiraling into despair, who chose violence as his solution. But because of how his defense was framed and how the media retold it, his case entered history not just as a double assassination, but as the case where a pack of Twinkies changed the course of justice. In the mid-1970s, the rolling farmlands of Red Bluff, California, seemed a world away from danger. But inside a modest home on the edge of town, one of the most horrific cases of captivity in American history unfolded. A story so unbelievable that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. The man at the center was Cameron Hooker, a lumber mill worker with a quiet demeanor, a wife, and young children. To his neighbors, he seemed ordinary, if somewhat reclusive. Behind closed doors, however, he harbored dark fantasies. Fantasies of domination, control, and sadistic imprisonment. His victim was a 20-year-old hitchhiker named Colleen Stan. On May 19, 1977, Colleen was hitchhiking from her home in Oregon to visit a friend in Northern California. She accepted a ride from Cameron Hooker, his wife Janice, and their infant child. To Colleen, it seemed safe, a young couple, a baby in the back seat. But once she got into their car, her life was stolen. Hooker drove her deep into the woods, pulled a knife, and forced her into submission. With Janice's cooperation, he placed a homemade wooden box over Colleen's head, muffling her cries, plunging her into darkness. From that moment forward, Colleen Stan became the girl in the box. For the next 7 years, Cameron Hooker held Colleen captive. At first, he confined her in a coffin-like wooden box beneath his bed, hours, days, sometimes weeks at a time. The box was small, stifling, and airless, lined with insulation to muffle sound. Colleen endured heat, suffocation, and unbearable isolation. When she was allowed out, Hooker subjected her to sexual assaults, bondage, and psychological torment. He told her she was now owned by a secret, powerful organization called the Company. If she disobeyed him, if she tried to escape, the Company would hunt her down, torture her, and kill her family. For Colleen, the fear was paralyzing. The psychology of control became Hooker's greatest weapon. He manipulated Colleen's perception of reality, eroding her sense of autonomy until obedience became instinct. He crafted contracts declaring her his slave. He forced her to call him master, and over time she began to comply, not because she wanted to, but because she believed resistance meant death. Neighbors occasionally saw her in the yard or around town, but they assumed she was a family friend, perhaps a babysitter. No one imagined the reality, that beneath the Hooker's bed lay a human being, hidden in a box, reduced to property. In 1984, after 7 years of captivity, Janice Hooker, Cameron's wife and accomplice, reached a breaking point. She confessed to her pastor what her husband had been doing. With her help, Colleen was freed. The case shocked the nation. How could a young woman be held prisoner for years, sometimes in plain sight, without escaping or crying for help? Why didn't she run? Why didn't she scream? The answer lay in the profound psychological hold Cameron Hooker had exerted. At trial, expert witnesses took the stand to explain Colleen's behavior. Psychologists testified about coercive persuasion and captivity trauma, the same dynamic seen in prisoners of war, hostages, and victims of cults. They argued that Colleen's compliance was not consent, but survival. Her inability to escape reflected not weakness, but the devastating power of psychological imprisonment. The defense, however, attacked these experts. They suggested Colleen had opportunities to flee, that she even visited her family once during captivity and returned willingly. To them, her compliance indicated choice, not coercion. The jury was asked to judge not only Cameron Hooker's actions, but also the credibility of the psychological science presented in his defense. In the end, the jury sided with the prosecution. Cameron Hooker was convicted of kidnapping, sexual assault, and multiple counts of torture. He was sentenced to 104 years in prison. Janice Hooker, who cooperated with authorities, received immunity in exchange for her testimony. The case of the girl in the box became a landmark in the legal use of psychological expertise. It forced courts to confront the reality that captivity does not always look like chains and locked doors. Sometimes the prison is built inside the mind. Colleen Stan's survival was extraordinary. She endured unimaginable torment yet emerged to tell her story, to face her captor in court, and to live beyond the box that defined her darkest years. The Hooker case remains a chilling reminder of how power, manipulation, and fear can enslave a human being without walls or bars. And it reminds us how fragile freedom can be when the mind itself is made to believe there is no escape. On March 30th, 1981, just 69 days into Ronald Reagan's presidency, the unthinkable happened. As the president left the Washington Hilton Hotel after a speech, shots rang out. Chaos erupted. Secret Service agents shoved Reagan into his limousine, but not before a bullet ricocheted off the car and lodged in his chest. 3 others were seriously wounded: Press Secretary James Brady, Police Officer Thomas Delahanty, and Secret Service Agent Tim McCarthy. The shooter was quickly wrestled to the ground. A pale, 25-year-old drifter named John Warnock Hinckley Jr. The world demanded to know, who was this young man, and why had he tried to kill the President of the United States? Hinckley's story began far from Washington. He was born in 1955, the youngest child of a wealthy Texas oil executive. On the surface, his upbringing was privileged, comfortable, stable. But beneath it, Hinckley struggled with isolation, depression, and an ever-deepening sense of inadequacy. By the mid-1970s, as a college student, Hinckley drifted. He dropped out repeatedly, unable to settle on a career or identity. He lived off allowances from his parents, bouncing between apartments and cheap hotels, increasingly withdrawn from the world. And then came his obsession. In 1976, Hinckley watched the film Taxi Driver, a gritty story of Travis Bickle, a lonely and unstable man who plots to assassinate a politician while becoming fixated on rescuing a young prostitute, played by a teenage Jodie Foster. For Hinckley, the movie was not fiction, it was prophecy. He began to identify with Bickle, the alienated anti-hero. More dangerously, he developed an infatuation with Jodie Foster herself. When Foster enrolled at Yale University in 1980, Hinckley followed. He slipped notes under her dorm room door. He called her repeatedly. His letters were filled with declarations of love, confusion, and desperation. Foster ignored him, but to Hinckley, her silence only deepened his obsession. In Hinckley's mind, the path to her heart required a grand gesture. He fantasized about hijacking a plane, committing suicide in front of her, even kidnapping her. Ultimately, he settled on assassination. If he could not win her love, he would earn her attention. Initially, he targeted President Jimmy Carter. He was arrested in 1980 with firearms while following Carter's campaign. But the arrest didn't deter him. By 1981, his focus shifted to President Ronald Reagan. Killing, or at least attempting to kill, the most powerful man in the world, Hinckley believed would make Jodie Foster notice him. The attempt nearly succeeded. Reagan nearly died from internal bleeding, saved only by the quick actions of his Secret Service detail and surgeons at George Washington University Hospital. James Brady, shot in the head, was permanently disabled, his life altered forever. The nation reeled. The president had survived, but barely. Now came the question of justice. Hinckley was charged with attempted assassination. His defense team prepared to argue that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. Psychiatrists examined him extensively. They found a man plagued by major depressive disorder, schizotypal traits, and profound delusions centered on Jodie Foster. He lived in fantasy, unable to separate reality from obsession. The prosecution countered with its own experts, arguing Hinckley knew exactly what he was doing, that his actions were calculated, planned, and therefore criminal. The courtroom became a battleground of psychiatric testimony. Each side presented elaborate analyses of Hinckley's mind. Was he psychotic, depressed, delusional, or simply manipulative? In June 1982, the jury delivered its stunning verdict. Not guilty by reason of insanity. Hinckley would not go to prison. Instead, he was committed indefinitely to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Washington, D.C. The verdict ignited outrage. The public saw a man who had nearly killed the president walk free of criminal responsibility. Newspapers seethed. Politicians demanded reform. Many felt the insanity defense had been abused, reduced to a loophole that allowed dangerous people to escape justice. Congress acted swiftly. In 1984, it passed the Insanity Defense Reform Act, tightening the standards for claiming insanity in federal cases. The law shifted the burden of proof, requiring defendants to demonstrate severe mental illness that left them unable to understand the nature or wrongfulness of their acts. The legacy of Hinckley's trial reshaped American criminal law. Hinckley spent decades confined to psychiatric care. Over the years, doctors reported progress. His depression stabilized, his obsessions faded, his behavior improved. Gradually, under strict supervision, he was allowed visits outside the hospital, then extended stays. Finally, in 2016, after 35 years of confinement, a judge ordered his release under conditions. He moved to live with his mother in Virginia, barred from contacting Jodie Foster or anyone associated with the Reagan family, forbidden to possess weapons or use social media without monitoring. In 2022, he was granted unconditional release. At 67, John Hinckley Jr. walked free, legally considered no longer a threat. The story of Hinckley forces us to confront unsettling questions. Can obsession become a form of madness? Should a delusion that leads to violence excuse responsibility or demand punishment? And when mental illness drives crime, where does justice end and treatment begin? For Ronald Reagan, the bullet wound became a scar carried for the rest of his life. For James Brady, it was a life sentence of disability. For Jodie Foster, it was years of unwanted attention from a man she never knew. And for John Hinckley Jr., it was a descent into history as the man who tried to kill a president. Not for ideology, not for politics, but for love that never existed. On a cold December night in 1985, two young men from Reno, Nevada, gathered in a friend's basement. Both were fans of heavy metal, their favorite band, the British group Judas Priest. They drank beer, smoked, and played their records loud, letting the music roar through their teenage frustrations. By morning, tragedy struck. James Vance, 20, and Ray Belknap, 18, had walked to a local playground with a shotgun. There, they made a suicide pact. Ray put the gun under his chin and pulled the trigger, dying instantly. James followed, but survived, his face horribly disfigured. James lingered for 3 years, enduring surgeries and unimaginable pain, before succumbing to complications. But before he died, he gave a statement that would launch one of the most unusual trials in American history. He claimed that Judas Priest's music had influenced their decision to die. The lawsuit, filed by the families, argued that subliminal messages were hidden in Judas Priest's 1978 album Stained Class. They claimed that when played at high volume, backward or beneath the music, The words "do it" could be heard. A sinister command, they said, that pushed vulnerable young men towards self-destruction. The case electrified the public. Could music, a band's art, its lyrics, its sound, actually drive someone to kill themselves? For Judas Priest, it was surreal. Lead singer Rob Halford and his bandmates suddenly found themselves not just musicians, but defendants in a trial that questioned the very power of art. The trial began in July 1990 in Reno. The plaintiff's lawyers argued that Judas Priest bore responsibility for the deaths. They called expert witnesses who testified about subliminal persuasion, the idea that hidden messages below conscious awareness could influence behavior. Psychologists debated whether such messages could bypass rational thought, planting seeds in the subconscious that later sprouted as action. The defense countered with science. They argued that subliminal persuasion was speculative at best, junk science at worst. They called their own experts, who explained that no credible evidence showed subliminal messages could compel someone to take drastic action like suicide. Rob Halford himself took the stand. In a dramatic moment, he brought headphones, connected them to the courtroom sound system, and played the record backward for the judge. Instead of sinister commands, he demonstrated the random garble that emerged when vinyl grooves were reversed. Indistinct sounds open to interpretation, like hearing words in clouds. At the heart of the case was a painful human truth. 2 young men had been lost, and their families were desperate for answers. James Vance and Ray Belknap were troubled before they ever pressed play on Judas Priest. They struggled with school, jobs, and futures that seemed uncertain. They drank heavily, battled depression, and sought solace in music that reflected their anger and alienation. The plaintiffs wanted to believe someone could be held accountable, that their sons had been manipulated rather than overwhelmed by despair. But the courtroom could not transform grief into proof. After weeks of testimony, the judge ruled in Judas Priest's favor. He found no evidence that subliminal messages caused the suicides. The case was dismissed. For the band, it was vindication but not victory. They had been accused of driving their fans to death, a wound that lingered. Rob Halford later described the ordeal as one of the most painful chapters of his life, not because he feared losing, but because of the parents' grief and the idea that music could be blamed for tragedy. The Judas Priest trial became a cultural touchstone in the debate over art, responsibility, and influence. Could artists be held accountable for how listeners interpreted their work? Should society police lyrics, melodies, or even imagined hidden messages? Psychologists who studied the case emphasized the broader issue, the vulnerability of distressed youth. When young people feel hopeless, they may latch onto music, media, or symbols as outlets for their pain. But the root cause lies not in the art, but in the struggle inside the listener. The case also highlighted the power of moral panic. In the 1980s and early 1990s, heavy metal often became a scapegoat for social fears, accused of promoting violence, drug use, or Satanism. The Judas Priest trial was the most extreme example, a courtroom deciding whether a guitar riff and a shouted lyric could kill. The verdict made clear that art cannot be criminalized for the tragedies of life. Yet the story of James Vance and Ray Belknap remains heartbreaking. Their deaths were not caused by a record, but by despair that society failed to recognize and treat. In the end, Judas Priest walked free, but the families left with their grief unresolved, and the trial left behind a haunting echo, a question that still lingers whenever a tragedy is linked to art, movies, or music. Is the message in the music, or is it in the heart of the listener who hears it? In the quiet suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, John Demjanjuk seemed like an ordinary man. He was a retired auto worker, a family man, a churchgoer. To his neighbors, he was John, unremarkable, unassuming. But in the 1970s, whispers began to surface. Whispers that John Demjanjuk was not who he claimed to be. That beneath the mask of an American immigrant lay one of the most notorious war criminals of the Holocaust. They said he was Ivan the Terrible, a brutal Ukrainian guard at Treblinka extermination camp, infamous for sadistic torture, mass executions, and cruelty that defied comprehension. Could the man grilling burgers in his backyard really be the same man survivors remembered wielding a whip and rifle as thousands marched to their deaths? The case began with documents unearthed by the U.S. Office of Special Investigations, which was tasked with identifying Nazi collaborators living in America. Among them was a wartime identity card suggesting Demjanjuk had served as a guard trained at Twinkie, the SS camp for auxiliary troops. Holocaust survivors from Israel and Europe were brought forward. When shown photographs of Demjanjuk, many pointed with certainty, "That is him. That is Ivan the Terrible." The U.S. government revoked his citizenship and extradited him to Israel to stand trial for crimes against humanity. The trial opened in Jerusalem in 1987, decades after Treblinka had been dismantled, its horrors buried beneath layers of history and silence. But inside the courtroom, the past returned with chilling immediacy. Holocaust survivors testified through tears. They described Ivan the Terrible as a monster who operated the gas chambers, who beat prisoners mercilessly, who seemed to revel in cruelty. Some said they could never forget his face, and they believed that face belonged to John Demjanjuk. The prosecution presented Demjanjuk not as an ordinary man, but as a hidden executioner of one of history's darkest crimes. Demjanjuk sat silent, expressionless. He denied the charges. His defense insisted he was not Ivan. He had been a Soviet soldier captured by the Germans, they said, never a concentration camp guard. The identity card was a forgery, they argued, produced by the KGB. The case hinged on memory and paper. Survivor identifications versus disputed documents. The courtroom became a stage for the deepest questions of justice. Could memory stretched across 4 decades be trusted? Could a single photograph resurrect certainty out of unimaginable trauma? In 1988, the verdict came down, guilty. The court sentenced John Demjanjuk to death by hanging. Survivors wept with relief. Israel prepared for an execution that would echo through history, second only to Adolf Eichmann's in its symbolism. But the story did not end there. As appeals moved forward, new evidence emerged. After the fall of the Soviet Union, archives opened in Moscow revealed further documents about Treblinka guards. Among them was information pointing to a different man as Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Marchenko, not John Demjanjuk. The evidence cast doubt on the conviction. In 1993, the Israeli Supreme Court overturned the verdict, ruling that Demjanjuk was not Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. He was freed, returned to the United States, and regained his citizenship. For survivors who had testified, it was a painful reversal. Their memories, so vivid, had been deemed mistaken. Yet justice had not released its grip. Years later, investigators uncovered new documents tying Demjanjuk not to Treblinka, but to Sobibor, another Nazi death camp. This time, the evidence was stronger. Records placing him as a guard, testimony from historians, and corroborating details from wartime rosters. In 2009, at age 89, Demjanjuk was extradited to Germany. His trial in Munich focused not on Ivan the Terrible, but on his role as an accessory to the murder of nearly 28,000 Jews at Sobibor. The German court took a different approach. Instead of requiring direct evidence of specific acts of cruelty, it ruled that anyone who served as a guard at a death camp was complicit in the machinery of genocide. The crime was not only in what one did, but in being part of the system that enabled mass murder. In 2011, Demjanjuk was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Too frail to be jailed, he lived in a nursing home while appealing the verdict. In 2012, he died at the age of 91. The story of John Demjanjuk remains one of the most complex in legal history. Was he Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka? Probably not. Was he a Nazi collaborator at Sobibor? The evidence says yes. For survivors, his trials were bittersweet. Moments of hope, disappointment, and partial justice. For legal scholars, the case raised profound questions about memory, time, and responsibility. How do you prosecute crimes committed decades earlier, when witnesses are aging and evidence is scarce? How do you balance the need for justice with the risk of error? What lingers most is the image of an ordinary man, living quietly in America, mowing his lawn, smiling at neighbors, accused of being part of the greatest atrocity in human history. Whether or not he was Ivan the Terrible, John Demjanjuk was not innocent. And his case ensured that even decades later, the pursuit of justice for the Holocaust would not be forgotten, nor forgiven. In the summer of 1991, Mike Tyson was more than a boxer. He was a global icon, the youngest heavyweight champion in history, a man whose fists seemed carved from granite, whose knockouts came like thunderbolts. But outside the ring, his life was spiraling. Failed marriages, financial troubles, erratic behavior, and a growing reputation for recklessness. That July, Tyson traveled to Indianapolis to attend the Miss Black America pageant. Among the contestants was Desiree Washington, an 18-year-old college student from Rhode Island. Intelligent, ambitious, and poised, Washington hoped the pageant would be a stepping stone to her future. Instead, it became the beginning of her nightmare. According to Washington's account, Tyson invited her to his hotel suite late one night after the pageant's events had ended. She accepted, believing it was a chance to meet one of the most famous men alive, perhaps even to gain connections that could help her career. But when she arrived, the evening took a violent turn. Washington testified that Tyson forced himself on her, ignoring her protests, overpowering her with brute strength. She described screaming no, begging him to stop, and being left battered and traumatized. The next morning, she confided in a friend, then went to the hospital. A rape kit was performed, documenting injuries consistent with her account. Soon after, charges were filed. For Tyson, it was a stunning reversal. The man who had risen from the streets of Brooklyn to the pinnacle of sports now stood accused of one of the most reviled crimes: rape. The trial opened in January 1992 in an Indianapolis courtroom. From the beginning, it was a clash of narratives. The prosecution argued the case was simple. Desiree Washington said no. Tyson ignored her, and the physical evidence supported her story. They painted Tyson as entitled, impulsive, and accustomed to taking whatever he wanted, whether inside the ring or outside it. The defense countered with a different picture. They claimed the encounter was consensual, that Washington willingly went to Tyson's hotel room in the early morning hours, knowing his intentions. They emphasized the lack of eyewitnesses, the absence of DNA proof beyond injuries, and argued that Washington had reasons to exaggerate or fabricate. Washington took the stand. Her testimony was powerful, steady, and unwavering. She described in detail how Tyson had pinned her, ignored her cries, and left her in tears. Her words carried the rawness of trauma, her composure reflecting both strength and vulnerability. Tyson, too, testified. He denied rape. He insisted Washington had consented, that there had been no force, no resistance. To the jury, it became a battle of credibility. Whose account rang truer? The trial also turned into a public referendum on gender, power, and celebrity. Tyson's supporters argued he was being targeted, that he was the victim of a racial and cultural double standard. Others saw the case as emblematic of male entitlement, proof that even the most glamorous athletes could not escape accountability for violence against women. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty. Tyson was convicted of rape and sentenced to 6 years in prison. The aftermath was explosive. Tyson's fans wept and raged, insisting he had been railroaded. Feminist groups hailed the verdict as a milestone, proof that a young woman's word could bring down even the most powerful of men. Desiree Washington, however, paid a steep price. She endured harassment, threats, and endless scrutiny. The media dissected her life, her motives, her character. For years, her name was synonymous with the trial, overshadowing the life she had once dreamed of building. Tyson served 3 years before being released on parole in 1995. He returned to boxing, regaining success in the ring, though never fully reclaiming his old dominance. His career and his public image remained forever tainted. The Tyson case revealed the deep divides in how society views rape, consent, and power. Was it possible, some asked, for an ordinary young woman to say no to a superstar and be believed? The jury's answer was yes, at least in that courtroom on that day. But the scars endured. For Desiree Washington, the cost of speaking truth was lifelong. For Mike Tyson, the conviction became both a punishment and a stain he could never escape. And for the public, the case forced a reckoning. Fame could no longer shield men from the consequences of sexual violence. On the night of August 20th, 1989, in Beverly Hills, a mansion on Elm Drive erupted with the sound of gunfire. Inside, the bodies of Jose and Kitty Menendez lay slumped on a couch, their faces and torsos torn apart by blasts from a 12-gauge shotgun. The scene was horrific. Jose, a Cuban-born entertainment executive, had been struck in the back of the head, his skull shattered. Kitty, his wife, had been shot multiple times as she tried to crawl away. Blood spattered across the living room, furniture shredded by bullets. Their killers? Not masked intruders, not mafia hitmen, but their own sons, Lyle and Eric Menendez. Lyle was 21, Eric just 18. To outsiders, they seemed like the privileged sons of a wealthy family, tennis, luxury cars, Ivy League schools. But that night, they unleashed a fury that would shock the nation. After the murders, the brothers didn't hide in fear. They drove to a movie theater to establish an alibi, then returned home to call 911. Their cries were frantic, their voices shaking as they screamed, "Somebody killed our parents." At first, the police suspected a mob-style execution. Jose's business dealings in Hollywood and beyond provided plenty of possible enemies. Investigators looked at his financial ties, his work in the music and entertainment industry, his rumored connections. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric went on with life. Shopping sprees, expensive restaurants, luxury cars. Within months, they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars from their parents' estate. But whispers began to grow. Their spending seemed too brazen, their grief too shallow. Detectives started to suspect the unthinkable, that the brothers themselves had committed the murders. The break came through an unlikely source, a therapist. Eric, racked by guilt, confided to his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oswald, that he and his brother had killed their parents. Lyle later joined sessions, admitting the same. Oswald's mistress secretly taped some of those confessions, and the recordings found their way to police. By 1990, Lyle and Eric were arrested. The trial that followed became one of the first true crime spectacles of the television age. Court TV had just launched, and the Menendez case became its defining broadcast. Americans glued to their screens, watching every tear, every testimony, every dramatic twist. The prosecution's case was simple: greed. The brothers, prosecutors argued, killed to inherit their parents' fortune. Their lavish spending after the murders was the proof. But the defense offered a very different story, one that shocked viewers. Eric and Lyle claimed they had been victims, too. They said their father, Jose, was a tyrant, controlling, domineering, abusive. They alleged he had sexually abused Eric for years, that their mother Kitty turned a blind eye, and that both parents terrorized them emotionally and physically. The brothers testified that they feared for their lives, that on the night of the murders, they believed their parents were about to kill them. The killings, they said, were not cold-blooded executions but acts of desperate self-defense. The courtroom was divided. Some jurors wept as Eric described years of abuse. Others doubted, believing the story was a fabrication designed to justify greed-driven patricide. The first trial ended in deadlock. Jurors could not agree. Some believed the abuse was real, others thought it irrelevant. By the time of the second trial in 1995, the mood had shifted. The judge limited the defense's ability to present the abuse narrative in full. Prosecutors hammered home the spending spree, the premeditation, the brutality of the murders. This time, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Lyle and Eric Menendez were sentenced to life in prison without parole. The case left the nation divided. Were the brothers calculating killers who murdered for money, or were they broken children lashing out after years of torment? Psychologists pointed to the complexity of familial abuse, the blurred line between victim and perpetrator. Could years of trauma create a mindset in which violence seemed the only escape? Or was that explanation simply a convenient shield against accountability? The Menendez trial also highlighted America's fascination with wealth, privilege, and dysfunction. The idea that two boys from Beverly Hills, dressed in preppy sweaters, raised in mansions, could commit such a crime fed both horror and fascination. Decades later, the Menendez brothers remain in prison. In recent years, documentaries and new cultural conversations about trauma have reopened debate. Younger generations, viewing their testimony with fresh eyes, have asked whether their story of abuse deserved more weight. But the verdict stands. Lyle and Eric Menendez murdered their parents. And whether it was for money, for freedom, or out of fear, the gunshots that echoed through that Beverly Hills mansion continue to reverberate in America's collective memory. On a summer night in June 1993, in the quiet town of Manassas, Virginia, an ordinary suburban marriage erupted into one of the most infamous acts of domestic violence ever recorded. In the early hours of the morning, Lorena Bobbitt, a 24-year-old manicurist originally from Ecuador, stood in her kitchen clutching a carving knife. Moments earlier, she claimed her husband, John Wayne Bobbitt, had forced himself on her sexually. Now, as he lay asleep in their bed, she acted with shocking finality. Lorena pulled back the sheets and, with a swift motion, severed John's penis. She then fled the apartment, still gripping the knife and the severed organ, driving away in a daze. Eventually, she tossed it out the window into a field before continuing on. What happened next turned a private marital tragedy into a global media circus. John awoke in agony. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, and a frantic police search began to recover the missing organ. Hours later, it was found in the grass by the side of the road, packed in ice, and surgeons at a local hospital successfully reattached it in a grueling 9.5-hour operation. John Bobbitt survived, but the story, lurid, bizarre, almost unbelievable, became an international sensation overnight. As the case unfolded, two clashing narratives emerged. John claimed he was the victim of a violent, vengeful wife. He admitted the marriage was troubled but denied raping her that night. He painted Lorena as jealous, unstable, prone to fits of rage. Lorena told a very different story. She described years of abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual. She said John controlled her, belittled her, and repeatedly raped her. On that night, she said, the assault had pushed her past the breaking point. Acting in a fog of trauma and rage, she committed the unthinkable. The trial of Lorena Bobbitt became must-watch television. The courtroom was packed, not only with journalists but also with comedians and satirists looking for material. Late-night talk shows feasted on the case. Headlines screamed puns. The story became both tragedy and punchline. But inside the courtroom, the stakes were deadly serious. The prosecution argued Lorena was guilty of malicious wounding, that her act was premeditated, cruel, and criminal. They presented evidence that she had gone to the kitchen, chosen the knife, and returned to the bedroom with intent. The defense argued insanity, that Lorena had been driven by years of abuse into a temporary psychotic break, incapable of controlling her actions. Psychiatrists testified about battered woman syndrome, explaining how prolonged trauma can warp perception, fuel terror, and unleash violence in sudden, desperate bursts. Lorena herself testified. Her voice shook as she described the assaults, the control, the humiliation she said she endured. She told the jury she felt trapped, powerless, and that the mutilation was not calculated revenge, but an explosion of pent-up fear and rage. Her words resonated with many women watching across America, who saw in her story echoes of their own experiences of domestic violence. Meanwhile, John Bobbitt became something of a dark celebrity. He gave interviews, posed for magazines, and even, bizarrely, starred in adult films to prove his surgery had been successful. To some, he was pitiable. To others, exploitative. The case blurred the lines between victim and perpetrator, crime and retaliation, tragedy and spectacle. In January 1994, the verdict came down. The jury found Lorena Bobbitt not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. She was ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluation but avoided prison. The decision reflected a recognition of her trauma, but also highlighted society's struggle to address domestic violence. Was her act excusable, understandable, or simply criminal? The Bobbitt case left an indelible mark on American culture. It forced uncomfortable conversations about spousal abuse, marital rape, and gendered power dynamics. It also showed how quickly serious issues could be trivialized by a media eager for shock and humor. For Lorena, the years that followed were about rebuilding, reclaiming her life, and later advocating for victims of domestic violence. For John, the infamy lingered, his life marked by further arrests, lawsuits, and failed ventures. At its core, the Bobbitt case was not about a knife or a body part. It was about power, trauma, and what happens when cycles of abuse explode into violence. And it left behind a haunting question. In a world that often ignores the silent suffering inside homes, what happens when silence finally breaks in the most shocking way imaginable? San Francisco, November 27, 1978. City Hall buzzed with routine politics on a gray Monday morning. But before noon, gunshots shattered the building's calm. Inside, Dan White, a former police officer, firefighter, and recently resigned city supervisor, pulled out his revolver and shot Mayor George Moscone in his office. White then walked down the hall, entered the office of Harvey Milk, one of the nation's first openly gay elected officials, and shot him 5 times, including twice in the head. In minutes, 2 of San Francisco's most prominent leaders lay dead. White turned himself in later that day, tearfully admitting the killings. The city erupted in grief and rage. Harvey Milk had been more than a supervisor. He was a symbol of hope for the gay community, a man who fought openly for civil rights at a time when prejudice was raw and institutionalized. His death was a devastating blow. For the people of San Francisco, the question was not whether Dan White killed them. He had confessed. The question was why and what punishment fit his crime. At trial in 1979, prosecutors charged White with first-degree murder. They portrayed him as bitter, angry, and jealous. He had resigned his supervisor's seat in frustration, then begged for his job back. When Moscone refused and prepared to appoint a more progressive replacement, White armed himself and took revenge. The defense, however, offered a different story. They argued White was not a cold-blooded killer, but a man unraveling under depression. He was overwhelmed by financial troubles, professional disappointment, and inner turmoil. His judgment, they said, was impaired. And then came the detail that would brand the case forever. White's lawyers pointed to his junk food consumption, soda, candy, Twinkies, as evidence of his deteriorating mental state. They claimed his poor diet reflected and contributed to his depression, pushing him into a diminished capacity to reason. The press seized on it. Soon, everyone was talking about the Twinkie defense. Psychologists took the stand to explain White's condition. They described a man spiraling into despair, his once disciplined life eroded by lethargy, impulsivity, and hopelessness. They argued that in this state, he lacked the capacity for premeditation, the careful, deliberate planning required for first-degree murder. The jury listened. To the shock of many, they returned a verdict of voluntary manslaughter, not murder. White was sentenced to 7 years and 8 months in prison. The reaction was immediate and furious. San Francisco's LGBTQ+ community, already grieving Milk's death, exploded in outrage. On the night of the verdict, thousands gathered at City Hall in what began as a vigil, but erupted into violence. Police cars were set ablaze, windows smashed, officers clashed with demonstrators. It became known as the White Night Riots. For many, the verdict symbolized a justice system that valued excuses over lives, that minimized the cold-blooded killing of a gay man and a progressive mayor. White served just over 5 years before being released in 1984. But freedom brought no peace. In 1985, tormented by depression and his past, he took his own life by carbon monoxide poisoning. The legacy of the Dan White case endures. It is remembered less for the man himself than for what it revealed. The power of framing in a courtroom, the limits of legal definitions like premeditation, and the dangerous weight of symbolic justice. The phrase Twinkie defense became shorthand for absurd legal excuses, though in truth the argument was more about depression than snack cakes. Yet the label stuck, overshadowing the deeper questions about mental illness, responsibility, and bias in the justice system. For Harvey Milk, the story was different. In death, his legacy only grew. He became a martyr for equality, a figure celebrated worldwide as a pioneer of LGBTQ+ rights. The candlelight marches, the chants of "Harvey lives" ensured his voice did not die in City Hall. Dan White silenced him, but he could not silence the movement he inspired. The tragedy of November 27, 1978, remains one of America's darkest intersections of politics, prejudice, and psychology. It showed how justice can falter, not because facts are unclear, but because narratives can sway hearts in ways evidence alone cannot. And it left behind a bitter reminder. Sometimes, justice depends not only on what is proven, but on what a jury chooses to believe. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas. The motorcade rolled through Dealey Plaza, sunlight glinting off the black presidential limousine. Crowds lined the streets, cheering, waving, craning their necks for a glimpse of President John F. Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline. At 12:30 p.m., the cheers turned to screams. 3 shots rang out. The president slumped forward, a fatal wound tearing through his skull. Within hours, a suspect was in custody, Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald's life before that moment had been a tangle of contradictions. Born in New Orleans in 1939, raised by a single mother, he was described as withdrawn, brooding, and restless. From adolescence, he dreamed of grand significance but never found a place where he fit. At 17, he joined the Marines, where he proved an adequate marksman but clashed with authority. Restless, he defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, announcing his embrace of communism. He married a Russian woman, Marina, but soon grew disillusioned with life behind the Iron Curtain and returned to the U.S. with her in 1962. Back in America, Oswald drifted from job to job, dabbling in radical politics, handing out pro-Castro pamphlets, railing against capitalism. To neighbors, he was odd, moody, but not especially dangerous. To himself, he was a man destined for greatness, a revolutionary waiting to be recognized. On that November day, Oswald was working at the Texas School Book Depository, overlooking Dealey Plaza. Investigators later found a rifle on the 6th floor, cartridges scattered nearby. Witnesses recalled seeing a man in the window. Within 90 minutes of the assassination, Oswald shot and killed Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, who had stopped him on the street. Soon after, he was captured in a movie theater. Brought into custody, Oswald denied everything. "I'm just a patsy," he told reporters. He insisted he hadn't killed the president, hadn't killed Tippit. But the evidence mounted. The rifle traced back to him, the prints, the ballistic matches. Psychologists who later examined his life saw the portrait of a loner fueled by grievance and grandiosity. He wanted recognition, power, a place in history. Yet his life was filled with mediocrity and rejection. Was the assassination his desperate bid to matter? Oswald never had the chance to tell his story in court. On November 24, 1963, as he was being transferred from the Dallas police station, nightclub owner Jack Ruby stepped forward with a revolver. On live television, watched by millions, Ruby shot Oswald in the stomach. Oswald collapsed, gasping, and died soon after in a hospital, the same one where President Kennedy had been pronounced dead 2 days earlier. The nation was left with questions unanswered. Without a trial, without testimony, Oswald's motives remained opaque. The Warren Commission, established by President Lyndon Johnson, concluded that Oswald acted alone. He fired 3 shots from the book depository, killing Kennedy and wounding Texas Governor John Connally. But suspicions lingered. Many refused to believe that a disaffected 24-year-old could alter history so profoundly without help. Conspiracy theories proliferated. Was he part of a Soviet plot? A CIA operation? The Mafia? Cuba? Did he act as a pawn in some larger scheme? Or was he simply a bitter man who seized his moment of infamy? Psychologists studying Oswald emphasize his craving for recognition. His life was marked by frustration, by a sense of insignificance. He had failed in the Marines, failed in the Soviet Union, failed as a husband and provider. Shooting Kennedy, some argue, was his twisted way of declaring, "I exist, I matter," but in death he became more myth than man. The absence of a trial left his motives forever speculative. his true psychology frozen in fragments of diaries, testimonies, and speculation. The assassination of JFK was not just a political murder. It was a cultural rupture. For millions, it shattered faith in security, in innocence, in the stability of the American dream. And at the center stood Lee Harvey Oswald, a confused, angry, isolated young man who, with a rifle and 3 bullets, changed the course of history. In the end, Oswald never got the trial he claimed he wanted. Never had the chance to proclaim his innocence or confess his motives. He left behind only a haunting legacy, the reminder that sometimes the most ordinary-seeming men can commit the most extraordinary acts of violence. And with him died the answer to one of history's most enduring questions. Why? February 4th, 1974. Berkeley, California. The night was quiet when a commotion shattered the calm at an apartment building near the University of California campus. Armed intruders burst through the door, dragged a screaming young woman from her home, and forced her into a waiting car. The victim was Patricia Campbell Hearst, better known as Patty Hearst, the 19-year-old granddaughter of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, one of the wealthiest and most powerful media figures in the country. Within hours, Patty was gone, swallowed into the underground world of a radical group calling itself the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA. The SLA was a small but fanatical band of revolutionaries. They spoke in fiery manifestos about overthrowing capitalism, destroying the system, and fighting for the oppressed. But their actions often blurred into violence and chaos. Robberies, kidnappings, political assassinations. For them, Patty Hearst was not just a captive. She was a symbol, a bargaining chip with enormous media value. Days after the kidnapping, the SLA released a tape. Patty's voice, trembling, pleaded with her parents to meet the group's demands. The immediate distribution of millions of dollars worth of food to the poor of California. The Hearst family scrambled, funding massive food giveaways in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Crowds surged. The chaos overwhelmed organizers. But the SLA was not satisfied. And then, the story took a turn that stunned the nation. 2 months later, another tape arrived. This time, Patty's voice was different. Sharper, more militant. She announced she had joined the SLA. Soon after, surveillance cameras captured her wielding a rifle during a bank robbery in San Francisco. The photo was electrifying. The heiress, the victim, was now seen as an outlaw. America asked, had Patty Hearst been brainwashed, or had she chosen rebellion? For more than a year, Patty remained with the SLA. They robbed banks, exchanged gunfire with police, lived as fugitives. In May 1974, a dramatic shootout in Los Angeles ended with 6 SLA members dead, their hideout engulfed in flames broadcast live on television. But Patty was not among them. She was captured in 1975, arrested with other surviving SLA members. The photograph of her arrest, thin, disheveled, glaring defiantly at the camera, became another symbol of her transformation. Her trial in 1976 was unlike any the country had seen. The prosecution argued Patty had become a willing participant. They pointed to her taped declarations, her role in robberies, her apparent loyalty to the SLA cause. She was not a victim, they said, but a radical who embraced crime. The defense, led by famed attorney F. Lee Bailey, countered that Patty was the ultimate victim. Kidnapped, terrorized, and subjected to coercive persuasion, what the public called brainwashing. They described beatings, sexual assaults, threats of execution. Under such psychological torture, they argued Patty's mind had been bent to survive. Her participation in crimes was not free will, but compliance under duress. Psychologists testified about Stockholm Syndrome, the phenomenon where captives develop loyalty to their captors as a survival mechanism. Patty, they said, had been broken down, reprogrammed, and used as a pawn. Patty herself testified. She admitted her fear, the threats, the abuse. But the jury was not fully persuaded. They saw the bank footage, the fiery rhetoric on tapes, the months of apparent loyalty. In March 1976, Patty Hearst was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 7 years in prison. The public was torn. To some, she was a privileged heiress who had betrayed her family and country. To others, she was a young woman brutalized by fanatics, punished unfairly for trying to survive. Her case became a cultural mirror, reflecting questions about power, privilege, gender, and psychology. Could anyone, under enough coercion, be made to act against their will? Or was her rebellion a secret desire, unlocked by circumstance? In 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence after she served just 22 months. In 2001, President Bill Clinton granted her a full pardon. Patty rebuilt her life quietly, withdrawing from the public except for occasional reemergence in memoirs and documentaries. The story of Patty Hearst endures because it resists simple answers. Victim or rebel, brainwashed pawn or willing revolutionary. Perhaps she was all of these at different moments. But one truth remains clear. Her kidnapping and transformation forced America to confront the unsettling power of coercion. How fragile is free will when terror, violence, and indoctrination collide. March 30th, 1981. Washington, D.C. The president's motorcade pulled up to the Washington Hilton. Crowds gathered outside as Ronald Reagan, just 69 days into his presidency, waved and smiled. Secret Service agents formed a protective wall as he walked toward his limousine. Suddenly, shots rang out. In the chaos, a small-caliber revolver fired 6 times. Bullets struck Press Secretary James Brady, Police Officer Thomas Delahanty, and Secret Service Agent Timothy McCarthy. One ricocheted off the limousine, tearing into President Reagan's chest. For a moment, the world held its breath. The president was rushed to the hospital, bleeding internally. He nearly died. The gunman was quickly subdued. His name, John Warnock Hinckley, Jr. Hinckley was 25 years old, the son of a wealthy oil executive from Texas. Outwardly, he seemed unremarkable, soft-spoken, a college dropout drifting aimlessly between homes and odd jobs. Inwardly, his mind was a storm of loneliness, delusion, and obsession. From his teenage years, Hinckley struggled to fit in. He failed academically, socially, romantically. He retreated into fantasies, finding solace in films and music. One film in particular, Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, consumed him. In it, Robert De Niro plays Travis Bickle, a disturbed loner who plots to assassinate a political figure while obsessing over a young woman. To Hinckley, the film was not just entertainment. It was prophecy. And at the center of his obsession stood the actress Jodie Foster, who had played a teenage sex worker in the film. Hinckley followed Foster's career with a disturbing fixation. When she enrolled at Yale University, he moved to New Haven, sending her letters and notes trying to make contact. He believed, irrationally, desperately, that a dramatic act would win her love. That act, in his mind, was political assassination. First, he stalked Jimmy Carter, traveling with firearms but never striking. Later, he shifted his focus to Reagan, seeing in the president the ultimate target that could thrust him into history, and, in his delusion, into Foster's heart. At his trial in 1982, the evidence of his obsession was overwhelming. The prosecution presented his diaries, in which he wrote of Foster constantly, of his longing, of his plan to impress her. He had scrawled fantasies about killing to prove his worth. The defense did not dispute the shooting. Instead, they argued insanity. Hinckley, they said, was psychotic, trapped in delusions that controlled him. He did not understand the wrongfulness of his act. He was acting in the grip of mental illness. Psychiatrists described his narcissistic personality disorder, his major depression, and his delusional fixation on Foster. They painted the portrait of a young man whose inner world collapsed into fantasy, who could no longer separate reality from obsession. The trial riveted the nation. Reagan survived, showing remarkable resilience, even joking with doctors as he recovered. But the image of the president felled by a lovesick drifter shook America's sense of security. When the verdict came, it stunned many. Not guilty by reason of insanity. Hinckley was committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., indefinitely. The backlash was fierce. Polls showed most Americans believed justice had failed. To them, the insanity defense had become a loophole, a way for criminals to evade accountability. In response, Many states tightened the standards for insanity pleas, making it harder for defendants to claim mental illness as a shield. Hinckley, meanwhile, lived in psychiatric custody for decades. Over the years, doctors reported progress. His delusions faded, his obsessions diminished. By the 2000s, supervised visits and conditional releases began. Finally, in 2016, more than 35 years after the shooting, John Hinckley Jr. was released to live with his mother under strict conditions. By 2022, all restrictions were lifted. He was a free man. The Reagan shooting and Hinckley's trial forced America to confront uncomfortable questions. Can obsession override free will? When does delusion become destiny? And how should the justice system balance punishment with the reality of mental illness? For Hinckley, his name will forever be tied to the bullet that nearly killed a president. For Jodie Foster, the unwanted object of his obsession, it was a chilling reminder of fame's dangers and how a stranger's fantasy could reshape her life. And for America, the case marked a turning point, a reminder that even the most powerful leader in the world could be brought to the brink by a lonely young man chasing a dream of love through violence. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, July 22, 1991. A man named Tracy Edwards stumbled into the street, handcuffed, frantic, begging for help. Police officers followed him back to an apartment in the Oxford Apartments building. When they opened the door, what they found would horrify not just Milwaukee, but the entire world. Inside the refrigerator were human heads. In the freezer, bags of flesh. Drawers held bones. Photographs showed bodies dismembered, staged. The stench of death filled the air. This was the home of Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer's story began quietly. Born in 1960, raised in suburban Ohio, he seemed like a shy, awkward boy. Teachers remembered him as withdrawn, intelligent, but increasingly isolated. From adolescence, he displayed disturbing fascinations. Dead animals, dissection, bones. As he grew older, those fascinations turned toward darker fantasies. He dreamed not of relationships, but of control, of keeping others forever. At 18, just weeks after graduating high school, Dahmer committed his first murder. He picked up a hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, lured him home, and bludgeoned him to death. He dismembered the body, scattering the remains. After that, years of dormancy followed, but the fantasies never left. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dahmer's crimes accelerated with terrifying speed. He lured young men, often gay men of color, back to his apartment with promises of money, drinks, or photographs. Once inside, he drugged them, strangled them, and kept their bodies. Dahmer experimented with preserving skulls, with dissolving flesh in acid, with drilling holes in victims' heads in attempts to create zombies who would remain with him forever. The horror was not only the killing, but the consuming. Dahmer admitted to cannibalism, eating hearts, muscles, even cooking human flesh in his small kitchen. Neighbors had noticed strange smells, odd noises, but complaints never led to deeper investigation. Once, police even returned a drugged 14-year-old boy to Dahmer after neighbors called for help, believing it was just a domestic dispute. The boy was later killed. For years, Dahmer moved in plain sight, his crimes hidden by chance, neglect, and society's blind spots toward marginalized victims. At trial in 1992, Dahmer faced 15 counts of murder. He confessed in chilling detail, describing his methods with a detached calm that stunned the courtroom. The defense argued insanity, that no sane man could commit such atrocities. Psychiatrists testified about his necrophilia, cannibalism, his obsessive need for control, his inability to form normal human bonds. They painted him as a man consumed by compulsion, driven by paraphilic urges beyond comprehension. The prosecution countered that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing. He lured, planned, concealed. He bought barrels, chemicals, locks. He took calculated steps to avoid detection. His actions, they said, were not madness but monstrous choices. The jury agreed. Dahmer was found legally sane and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, nearly 1,000 years behind bars. In prison, he was both reviled and bizarrely fascinated over. Some saw him as a monster beyond humanity. Others tried to understand him as a man whose brain had warped into evil. Dahmer himself seemed almost relieved to be caught. He told interviewers he felt a sense of closure, that he had long known he could not stop himself. He even sought religious redemption, undergoing baptism in prison. But on November 28, 1994, another inmate bludgeoned Dahmer to death in a prison bathroom. The killer said he did it because of Dahmer's crimes, and because Dahmer reportedly mocked other inmates by shaping food into body parts. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer left scars not just in Milwaukee, but across the world. It forced society to confront the depths of human depravity, the failures of law enforcement, the vulnerability of marginalized communities, and the uneasy line between madness and evil. Psychologists continue to debate. Was Dahmer a product of mental illness, or simply a predator who surrendered to his darkest desires? For the families of his victims, the questions offered no comfort. Their sons, brothers, and friends were gone, lives erased in ways too horrific to imagine. And for the rest of us, Dahmer's name became synonymous with monstrosity, a reminder of what can hide behind the face of an ordinary neighbor, a man living quietly in an apartment, with nightmares locked behind his door. June 20th, 2001. Houston, Texas. The morning began quietly in a modest suburban home. Andrea Yates, a 36-year-old former nurse, filled the bathtub with water. Her 5 children, ranging from 7-year-old Noah to 6-month-old Mary, played and watched television, unaware of what was about to unfold. One by one, Andrea carried them to the bathroom. She held each child under the water until their small bodies went still. When she was done, all 5 were dead. Then, calm and deliberate, Andrea called 911. She told police she had killed her children. The confession shocked the nation. Why would a mother commit such an unthinkable act? To understand Andrea Yates, investigators and psychiatrists delved into her history and uncovered years of struggle with severe mental illness. Andrea had been an overachiever in her youth, valedictorian, nurse, devoted wife. But behind her bright exterior, she battled depression. After marrying Rusty Yates in 1993, her life centered on raising children in accordance with their shared religious beliefs, which emphasized motherhood as a sacred duty. Between 1994 and 2000, Andrea gave birth to 5 children in rapid succession. The pregnancies, combined with her predisposition to depression, led to episodes of postpartum psychosis, severe breaks with reality marked by hallucinations, delusions, and suicidal thoughts. She was hospitalized multiple times. Doctors warned against having more children, fearing her mental health could collapse. Yet the family continued to grow. By 2001, Andrea's condition had deteriorated drastically. She was taking antipsychotic medications, but cycles of improvement and relapse continued. She heard voices. She believed she was a bad mother. She feared she was raising damned children who would go to hell because of her failures. On that June morning, Andrea later explained, she drowned her children not out of malice, but to save their souls. She believed Satan was within her, corrupting her, and that death was the only way to protect them. The trial that followed became a battleground between law and psychiatry. The prosecution argued Andrea knew her actions were wrong. They pointed to her calm demeanor after the killings, her 911 call, her statements to police. They said she chose murder, fully aware of its consequences. The defense countered that Andrea was in the grip of psychosis, detached from reality, convinced her actions were righteous. She was, they argued, legally insane. Psychiatrists testified on both sides. Some described her delusions in chilling detail. Her belief that the devil was inside her, her conviction that killing her children was an act of mercy. Others argued she still understood the legal and moral wrongfulness of murder, regardless of her illness. In 2002, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of capital murder. Andrea was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. But the case did not end there. In 2005, an appeals court overturned the conviction after it was revealed that a prosecution witness had given false testimony. A retrial was ordered. In 2006, the second trial reached a different conclusion. This time, Andrea was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a state mental hospital, where she remains to this day. The Yates case ignited fierce debate across America. Some saw Andrea as a murderer who betrayed the most basic human duty, a mother's protection. Others saw her as a tragic victim of untreated mental illness, failed by a healthcare system that recognized her danger but could not prevent catastrophe. The case raised broader questions. How should the law treat mental illness in criminal cases? Where is the line between responsibility and incapacity? And what can society do to protect vulnerable mothers from reaching such a breaking point? Andrea Yates's story remains one of the most haunting examples of the intersection between psychology and crime. Her children, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, became symbols of the devastating consequences of untreated psychosis, and her case forced the nation to confront the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the most horrifying acts are not born of malice, but of madness. Florida, late 1990s. A divorce case made its way into a local courtroom. At first glance, it seemed like any other custody battle. Two parents fighting over the future of their children. But this was no ordinary dispute. At its center was Michael Kantaras, a transgender man whose right to be recognized as a father would ignite one of the most public legal battles over gender identity in American history. Michael had been born female, named Margot, in 1959. From childhood, however, he felt a profound mismatch between his body and his sense of self. He dressed in boys' clothes, gravitated toward male roles, and longed to live as the person he knew himself to be. By adulthood, Michael transitioned. He underwent hormone therapy, chest reconstruction surgery, and legally changed his name. He lived fully as a man. In the late 1980s, Michael married a woman named Linda, who knew of his transition. The marriage, at least outwardly, looked like any other. They built a home, raised two children, one Linda's biological child from a previous relationship, the other conceived through artificial insemination but raised as their son. For years, they lived as a family. But by 1998, the marriage had fractured. When Michael filed for divorce, Linda countered with a devastating claim. She argued the marriage had never been valid because Michael, in her view, was not a man. If the marriage was invalid, she claimed, then Michael had no legal parental rights to the children he had raised. The courtroom erupted into a clash of law, medicine, and identity. The trial began in 2002 in a Florida court, and it quickly drew national attention. Cameras rolled as lawyers, doctors, psychologists, and clergy testified. Michael's legal team argued that gender is not defined solely by chromosomes, but by a combination of biology, psychology, and lived identity. Michael was, and always had been, male in every meaningful sense. To strip him of his fatherhood was to deny his humanity. Linda's attorneys countered with a narrower view. Biology was destiny. They claimed that because Michael was born with female anatomy and had not undergone genital surgery, he could not be legally recognized as male, and therefore could not be considered a husband or father under Florida law. Psychologists took the stand to explain the nature of gender dysphoria, the distress experienced when one's gender identity does not match one's assigned sex at birth. They spoke of the medical consensus, that transition is a recognized and necessary treatment, and that Michael's male identity was authentic and valid. Michael himself testified, his voice breaking as he described his lifelong struggle, his journey to live openly as himself, and his devotion to his children. The courtroom was not just deciding a custody case. It was debating the very definition of gender in America at the turn of the 21st century. In 2003, Judge Gerard O'Brien issued a groundbreaking ruling. He recognized Michael as a man, affirmed the validity of the marriage, and granted him custody rights. For a moment, it seemed like a landmark victory, not just for Michael but for transgender rights nationwide. But the battle was not over. Linda appealed, and in 2004, a Florida appellate court reversed the ruling, declaring the marriage invalid. Though Michael retained custody in practice, the broader recognition of his gender was struck down. The case stopped short of the U.S. Supreme Court, but its echoes resonated across the country. The Kantaras case highlighted the painful gap between lived reality and legal recognition. It forced the courts and the public to confront questions that had long been ignored. What defines gender, anatomy, chromosomes, or identity? How do laws written in one era apply to families in another? And how should justice protect children when legal categories lag behind human experience? Michael Kantaras lived through a public trial that dissected his most intimate truths. For him, the fight was not abstract. It was about his children, his family, his right to exist as himself in the eyes of the law. For America, his case was a preview of battles yet to come, over marriage equality, transgender rights, and the evolving understanding of identity. The trial ended, but its questions remain. In courtrooms, legislatures, and living rooms across the country, society continues to wrestle with the same issues: who we are, who we can become, and how the law reflects or resists those realities. And so, unlike many of the tragedies in this series, Michael Kantaras' case was not about death, but about life. It was about love, identity, and the courage to stand before the world and say, "This is who I am, this is my family, and we deserve to be recognized."